This story is a work of fiction, inspired by real emotional dynamics many families experience. Names, locations, and events have been altered for narrative purposes. It is a dramatized reflection, not a confession or an accusation. It began as an ordinary family meeting in my own living room, the kind we had held dozens of times before, quiet, polite, framed as practical and responsible. My parents said they wanted to talk about the future, retirement plans, paperwork, rising property taxes, the kinds of things adults discuss when they believe they are being thoughtful. I remember nodding, already half distracted, assuming this would be another conversation where decisions were outlined, and everyone politely agreed. My brother Benjamin sat across from me, relaxed, his arm draped over the back of the couch as if he already belonged there, in a way I never quite had. When my father finally spoke, his voice was steady, rehearsed, almost gentle. He said they had decided to put the house in Benjamin's name, not discuss it, not consider it, not weigh options. Decide. For a moment, I waited for the rest of the sentence, the part where my role appeared, where my years in that house were acknowledged, where my opinion might be invited. It never came. I asked a single question, careful, measured, asking what this meant for me. My mother answered before my father could, her tone calm but final, telling me this was not something they were opening up for conversation. I felt the room tilt, not dramatically, not loudly, but in a way that made it clear the ground under me had shifted without warning. Shock arrived first, not as anger, but as disbelief. I looked from my parents to my brother, searching for a signal that this was incomplete, that there was more to hear. Benjamin avoided my eyes. Doubt followed close behind, creeping in as I wondered if I had misunderstood, if this was somehow reasonable and I was missing the logic. I told myself they must have thought it through, that practical decisions often feel unfair in the moment. But as the seconds passed, something colder settled in. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a conclusion reached without me. The realization landed quietly and stayed. I had not been part of the conversation that led here, and I was not meant to be. The sense of being erased did not explode. It pressed in, heavy and slow, as my parents explained why this made sense, why Benjamin needed stability, why I would understand. Each word widened the distance between what they believed was fair and what I was feeling. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I sat there, listening, aware that the most painful part was not the house itself, but the certainty with which my silence was expected. In that moment, I understood that something fundamental had changed, even if no one else in the room seemed to notice. The meeting ended the way it began, politely, with cups gathered and chairs pushed back into place, as if nothing irreversible had occurred. But as I stood to leave, I felt the first stirrings of resistance, not loud or reckless, but deliberate. I did not yet know what would come next. I only knew that the story I had been quietly living in that family was no longer sustainable, and that whatever followed would be shaped by truth rather than permission. Favoritism rarely announces itself in obvious ways. In my family, it did not arrive with cruelty or raised voices. It settled in quietly, disguised as practicality, disguised as concern, disguised as common sense. Growing up, My brother Benjamin was always described as the one who needed more help. He was sensitive, they said. He struggled more. He carried more pressure. I was described differently. I was capable, reliable, independent. Those words sounded like compliments, and for a long time, I accepted them as such. I did not notice how often they were used to justify giving him more space, more patience, more protection. When he missed deadlines or changed plans at the last minute, it was understood. When I adapted, it was expected. Over time, this became the unspoken rhythm of our family. Benjamin was supported. I was assumed. When we were younger, it showed up in small ways. Who got checked on first? Whose mistakes were softened? Whose achievements were treated as proof that they would be fine on their own? I learned early that being dependable meant not needing anything back. By the time we were adults, the pattern had hardened into something more structural. Benjamin moved away for work, chasing opportunities that were framed as brave and necessary. I stayed nearby, not because I had failed to leave, but because proximity made sense. My parents were aging. Appointments needed rides. Paperwork needs sorting. The house needed maintenance. None of this was discussed as an obligation. It was simply what someone like me did. I was not living there for free. I paid my share, and often more. I covered utilities, handled repairs, and paid portions of property taxes when they rose unexpectedly. We never labeled it rent. It was just keeping things running. Benjamin visited on holiday. He was welcomed warmly, treated like a guest whose presence was precious because it was rare. I was present so often that my presence faded into the background. No one questioned this arrangement, not because it was fair, but because it worked. That is how favoritism survives in functional families. It hides behind efficiency. It tells itself that outcomes matter more than process. When decisions were made, they followed the same logic. Benjamin was building a life. I was already stable. Benjamin had responsibilities. I could manage. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a system where my contributions were invisible precisely because they were consistent. I did not resent my brother. That is important. This was not a story of jealousy. It was a story of erasure. Over the years, I noticed how often my role was to absorb inconvenience, quietly. When plans changed, I adjusted. When help was needed, I stepped in. When gratitude was expressed, it was brief, followed quickly by the next expectation. I told myself this was what maturity looked like. Doubt crept in slowly. Not about my family's intentions, but about my place within them. I began to sense that my value was measured less by what I felt and more by how little disruption I caused. Still, I did not push back. Resistance felt unnecessary, even ungrateful. I believed fairness would eventually reveal itself through effort. That belief carried me for years. It was only in hindsight that I could see how the system worked. Favoritism was not something anyone chose deliberately. It emerged from patterns left unexamined, from assumptions that hardened into rules, from the comfort of relying on the same person again and again without asking what it costs them. By the time my parents sat across from me in that living room, announcing a decision that excluded me entirely, they were not inventing a new imbalance. They were formalizing one that had existed all along. At that moment, doubt gave way to clarity. This was not about a single house or a single meeting. It was about a family structure that had quietly trained me to accept less voice in exchange for being seen as dependable. And once I saw it, I could no longer pretend it was accidental. The announcement itself did not arrive with drama. There was no raised voice, no slammed door, no accusation hanging in the air. That was what made it harder to challenge. My father spoke the way he always did when he believed he was being reasonable, calm, methodical, as if explaining something already settled. He said they had been thinking about the future, about simplifying things while they still could. He mentioned paperwork, long-term planning, and the idea of reducing complications later on. Then he said they were putting the house in Benjamin's name. He said it plainly, like a logistical step rather than a life-altering decision. For a brief moment, I assumed there would be more. A clarification, a discussion, a recognition that I lived there, that I had helped maintain the place, that my life was also shaped by what happened next. I waited, watching his face for a pause that never came. My mother nodded beside him, her expression composed, already braced for my reaction. I asked what this meant for me. It was the only question I asked. I did not demand explanations. I did not accuse. I simply asked where I fit into what they were describing. My mother answered quickly, before my father could respond, telling me that this was not something they were opening up for debate. She said it gently, as if trying to protect me from disappointment, as if the finality itself was an act of kindness. She added that this arrangement made sense, that Benjamin had more responsibilities, that he needed stability. I was independent, she said. I would understand. The words landed with a strange weight. Understand did not mean agree. It meant accept. As they spoke, the logic unfolded in familiar patterns. Benjamin had a family to think about. I had always managed on my own. They were not choosing him over me. They insisted. They were choosing what was practical. I listened, carefully, searching for any sign that my voice might matter. There was none. Each explanation closed another door. When I tried to speak again, my father raised his hand slightly. Not in anger, but in a way that signaled the conversation was complete. He said they had already decided. That phrase echoed louder than anything else. Already decided. It meant the discussion that should have included me had happened somewhere else. Without me, long before I sat on that couch, doubt crept in again. I wondered if I was overreacting, if this was simply how families handled these things. Plenty of people made decisions without unanimous agreement. Maybe this was normal. Maybe fairness was not the same as equality. I told myself I was being emotional. The way women are often taught to believe when something feels wrong but sounds reasonable on paper. Still, the discomfort did not fade. It sharpened. I noticed how carefully my parents avoided certain phrases. They did not say I had no right. They did not say the house was not mine. They did not say I was excluded. Instead, they framed the outcome as inevitable, necessary, sensible. There was no space in their language for disagreement, only for compliance. Benjamin remained quiet through most of it. He did not argue in my favor, but he did not gloat either. His silence was its own form of consent. He had been included in the decision. I had not. That distinction mattered more than any words spoken aloud. The meeting moved on quickly after that, as if the most difficult part was already over. My mother asked if anyone wanted tea. My father mentioned needing to find a folder with insurance documents. Ordinary gestures returned, signaling that for them. The matter was settled. I sat there, nodding when expected, aware that something had shifted beneath the surface. This was not just an unfair outcome. It was injustice made official. A private pattern had been formalized into policy. What had once been implied was now documented. The realization did not ignite anger. It produced a quieter response, a tightening awareness that I was being asked to disappear politely from a decision that shaped my own life. I left the house shortly after, offering no protest, no ultimatum. As I drove away, the shock gave way to a colder understanding. This was not a misunderstanding to be cleared up later. It was a line drawn deliberately, even if my parents did not see it that way. And once a line is drawn, pretending it does not exist only deepens the harm. The days after the announcement unfolded quietly, which made them harder to read. No one called to check in. No one followed up to ask how I was feeling. When I did speak to my parents, the conversations drifted around the decision without ever touching it directly, as if acknowledging my reaction might create a problem they did not want to manage. My mother mentioned errands and appointments, the usual rhythm of daily life, and when I hesitated, she reminded me gently not to take things so personally. She said they were only trying to do what was practical. My father echoed the same idea later, telling me that families have to make hard choices and that I should not let my emotions cloud my judgment. The words were measured, calm, and delivered with concern rather than hostility. That was the most disorienting part. Nothing they said sounded cruel on its own. Together, it created a fog where my response felt inappropriate, even excessive. I began to replay the meeting in my mind, searching for moments where I might have misunderstood, for signs that I had projected meaning where there was none. Doubt took root. I asked myself whether I had been expecting too much, whether my role in the family had always been more supportive than central. And I had simply failed to accept it. When I tried to articulate this uncertainty out loud, my mother reassured me that no one was excluding me, that I was imagining distance where there was only difference. She reminded me that Benjamin had more responsibilities, more pressure, more to lose. She said I was strong enough to handle change. Strength, once again, was used as an explanation rather than a gift. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. I would raise a concern cautiously, framing it as confusion rather than objection, and it would be met with reassurance that nothing unfair had happened. My feelings were acknowledged only to be dismissed, folded neatly into the category of understandable but unnecessary reactions. I was encouraged to be reasonable, to look at the bigger picture, to avoid making the situation uncomfortable for everyone involved. The message was subtle, but consistent. The problem was not the decision. The problem was my response to it. Benjamin remained distant. When we spoke briefly, he told me he hoped I was not upset, that this arrangement would make things simpler for everyone. He did not ask what it cost me. He assumed simplicity was neutral. I noticed how often I was urged to move on before I had fully understood what I was being asked to accept. The pressure was not loud. It arrived through repetition, through the suggestion that revisiting the topic would only cause tension, through the implication that continuing to question it meant I was unwilling to support the family. Over time, I felt myself shrinking my own reactions to fit the calm tone set around me. I stopped mentioning the house altogether. I told myself it was better not to stir things up. Yet the silence did not bring relief. It created a different kind of weight, one that settled internally. I began to question my instincts, to wonder whether fairness was a flexible concept, and I had simply failed to adapt. The absence of overt conflict made it difficult to trust my own discomfort. There were no clear villains here, only people who believed they were acting sensibly. That belief made it harder to push back. Gaslighting does not always look like denial or accusation. Sometimes it looks like concern wrapped around erasure. It sounds like encouragement to be understanding, while quietly redefining what understanding requires. I felt myself being guided toward acceptance, not through force, but through fatigue. Each interaction chipped away at my confidence that my perspective mattered. Still, something resisted beneath the surface. Even as doubt grew, it did not erase the clarity that had begun to form. I knew that if I allowed this pattern to continue unchallenged, it would not stop with the house. It would follow me into every future decision where my silence was more convenient than my voice. That realization did not push me toward confrontation. It pushed me toward restraint. I began to see that the calm surrounding me was not proof of fairness. It was proof of control exercised without conflict. And once I recognized that, the doubt no longer belonged entirely to me. Silence often looks like peace until it becomes policy. I left the house earlier than usual that night, not because anyone asked me to, but because staying felt dishonest. The conversation had ended politely, yet something in me had already disengaged. Driving home, anger finally surfaced, not sharp or explosive, but steady, pressing against my ribs. It was the anger of realizing how long I had explained myself away. At home, I did not pace or rehearse arguments. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my laptop, telling myself I only wanted to distract my mind. Instead, I found myself searching old folders, emails I had archived without much thought, digital traces of years spent keeping things afloat. Messages from contractors appeared first. Exchanges about a leaking roof, a failing water heater, a cracked driveway. Then, invoices were scanned and saved because someone had once asked me to keep records. I opened them slowly, noticing dates I barely remembered. A winter storm repair, an emergency plumbing call. A summer when the air conditioning failed during a heat wave. Each document carried a quiet familiarity. I had not saved these to prove anything. I had saved them because that was what I did when something needed managing. Next came bank statements. Lines highlighted from months when property taxes spiked or insurance premiums increased. I remembered the conversations that followed, brief acknowledgments that costs were rising, assurances that it was temporary. I had paid without hesitation, telling myself this was simply part of sharing responsibility. As the files accumulated on my screen, the anger shifted. It lost its heat and sharpened into something more precise. I was not discovering betrayal. I was discovering continuity. This was not about ownership. I could see that clearly now. My name was not on the deed. It had never been. There was no illusion left to dismantle there. What unsettled me was how thoroughly I had been involved in operating a life I had no voice in shaping. I had handled the house the way people handle things they expect to be responsible for long term. The realization did not make me feel foolish. It made me feel awake. Anger. I understood. had been a signal, not a plan. It pointed to a boundary I had never articulated because I did not know it was missing. Sitting there, surrounded by quiet evidence of effort, I felt the urge to confront my parents immediately, to lay everything out, to demand recognition. The thought passed quickly. That kind of confrontation would change nothing. It would turn clarity back into noise. I closed the laptop and sat in the silence, letting the weight of understanding settle. I did not own the house, but I had sustained it. I had been central without being consulted, reliable without being regarded. The distinction mattered. It explained why the announcement had felt so destabilizing. It had not taken anything away. It had confirmed something that had been true for a long time. I went to bed late, but I slept. Not deeply, but without the restless churn that had followed the meeting. In the morning, the anger was gone. In its place was resolution, not the kind that demands action, but the kind that clarifies direction. I knew I would not argue my way into fairness. I also knew I would not continue absorbing decisions made in my absence. The path forward was not about proving my worth or punishing anyone for overlooking it. It was about understanding the structure I was standing in and deciding whether to remain there unchanged. That night marked the shift from reaction to intention. I stopped asking myself whether I was allowed to speak and began asking what would happen if the truth simply existed. That question did not promise comfort. It promised alignment. And for the first time since the announcement, that felt like enough. I did not move quickly after that night, and I did not announce what I was doing to anyone. Preparation, I learned, works best when it stays quiet. I began by organizing what I already had, not with the urgency of someone building a case, but with the patience of someone trying to understand a pattern. I created a timeline, year by year, noting repairs, tax increases, insurance changes, and the months when unexpected costs appeared. I pulled statements that showed payments made during those periods, not to claim ownership, but to document involvement. The distinction mattered. I was not trying to rewrite history. I was trying to make it legible. When I felt overwhelmed, I stopped. This was not about proving I had been wronged. It was about ensuring the facts could stand on their own without my emotions carrying them. A week later, I scheduled a brief consultation with a local attorney in Madison, someone recommended by a colleague, not because I wanted to threaten anyone, but because I needed clarity. I told him I was not looking to contest ownership or escalate a dispute. I asked him to listen. He reviewed the documents quietly, asked a few precise questions, and then explained what I already suspected. My name was not on the deed. The transfer my parents mentioned had not been finalized. My payments did not give me legal ownership, but they were documented contributions that mattered in understanding how decisions had been made. He did not suggest confrontation. He did not advise ultimatums. He outlined options. Nothing more. The most important thing he said was that facts, when presented calmly, change the shape of a conversation even if they do not change its outcome. That stayed with me. I continued organizing, separating feelings from records. Emails were grouped by year. Invoices were labeled by purpose. Bank statements were highlighted only where they corresponded to house-related expenses. I avoided adding commentary. No annotations. No explanations. The documents needed to speak for themselves. As I worked, I noticed how often I had stepped in without being asked, how rarely those moments were acknowledged beyond a quick thank you. This was not new information. What was new was seeing it all in one place, stripped of context and justification. Preparation did not make me feel powerful. It made me feel steady. I resisted the impulse to reach out to my parents or my brother. Silence, at this stage, was not avoidance. It was discipline. I needed to be certain that when I did speak, I would not be negotiating from hurt. I would be presenting reality. I also decided what I would not do. I would not ambush anyone. I would not share documents casually. I would not involve people who had already taken sides. If the truth was going to enter the room, it would do so without spectacle. I asked my Aunt Margaret, who had always been measured and fair, if she would be willing to sit in on a future conversation, not to argue, but to witness. She agreed without question. I let the attorney know I might ask him to attend as well, not to speak, but to confirm facts if needed. He understood. Weeks passed. Life continued. My parents spoke to me as they always had. Assuming my quiet meant acceptance, I did not correct them. The preparation phase taught me something unexpected. Gathering facts was not about building leverage. It was about reclaiming authorship over my own understanding. I was no longer guessing at motives or intentions. I was grounded in what had actually happened. That grounding softened something in me. I felt less reactive, less tempted to interpret every interaction as a test. When the time came to revisit the conversation, I knew I would not be asking for permission to be heard. I would be making space for the truth to exist. Preparation was not a prelude to conflict. It was a commitment to dignity. By the time I closed the folder and set it aside, I was no longer rehearsing what I would say. I was ready to let the facts do their quiet work. The second family meeting was scheduled without urgency, which was exactly how I wanted it. There were no raised expectations, no dramatic framing, no announcement that anything important was about to happen. My parents believed this conversation would simply finalize what had already been decided. That assumption created the space I needed. We gathered in the same living room, the furniture arranged as it always had been, familiar enough to lower defenses. My Aunt Margaret arrived a few minutes early, greeted politely, her presence unremarkable to anyone who did not understand why she was there. The attorney came last, introduced briefly as someone I had asked to listen and clarify details if necessary. He did not carry a briefcase. He did not take notes. He sat quietly, hands folded, and said very little. I remember noticing how ordinary everything felt, how easy it would have been to pretend this was just another discussion that would fade into routine. My father began by restating their plan, his voice calm, his reasoning unchanged. He spoke about simplicity, about avoiding complications later, about doing what made sense for everyone. When he finished, the room paused, waiting for my response. I did not argue. I did not interrupt. I slid the folder forward onto the coffee table and leaned back in my chair. For a moment, no one moved. The gesture was simple, almost understated, but it shifted the room. My mother looked at the folder, then at me, uncertainty flickering across her face. I said very little. I explained only that I wanted the facts to exist in the open, that I was not accusing anyone or asking for anything. I just needed the truth on the table. My aunt opened the folder first, flipping through the pages slowly. Dates, receipts, emails, bank statements. Not arranged for impact, just organized. She did not react dramatically. She simply read. My parents followed her gaze, their expressions tightening not with anger, but with concentration. The attorney spoke once, clarifying that the transfer had not been completed and outlining, in neutral terms, what the documents showed and what they did not. He did not argue for me. He did not suggest outcomes. He confirmed facts and then fell silent again. The room grew quiet in a way that felt different from before. This was not the quiet of avoidance. It was the quiet of recalibration. My mother broke it first, her voice softer than earlier, asking when I had paid for certain repairs. I answered briefly. My father asked why I had not said anything sooner. I told him that private conversations were how this pattern had continued, that speaking quietly one-on-one had never changed the outcome. There was no accusation in my tone, only explanation. Benjamin shifted uncomfortably, flipping through a page before setting it down. He said he had not realized how much I had handled. It was not an apology. It was recognition. That was enough for the moment. No one raised their voice. No one defended themselves aggressively. The facts did not provoke a fight. They altered the atmosphere. The assumptions that had carried the original decision no longer held the same weight. My parents did not reverse anything that afternoon. They did not offer immediate solutions or sweeping statements of fairness. What they did was hesitate. That hesitation mattered. It meant the certainty that had excluded me was no longer intact. The meeting ended without resolution, and that was intentional. I gathered my things calmly. My aunt squeezed my hand gently before leaving. The attorney nodded once and stepped outside. As the door closed behind us, I felt neither triumph nor relief. What I felt was alignment. The truth had entered the room without spectacle. It had not humiliated anyone. It had simply taken up space. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded quietly. Conversations slowed. Decisions were postponed. My parents asked more questions instead of offering conclusions. Benjamin became more careful with his words. The structure that had once moved smoothly on my silence now had to adjust to my presence. Public exposure is often imagined as a moment of reckoning, but this was not that. It was procedural, deliberate, almost restrained. There were no winners declared, no losers assigned. There was only the reality that certain facts could no longer be ignored. That was the turning point. Not because anyone was shamed, but because the narrative had shifted from convenience to truth. And once truth is acknowledged, even reluctantly, it begins to change what is possible next. Truth does not need to be loud to be effective. The period after that meeting did not bring closure, and it did not bring celebration. It brought a slower, more uncertain rhythm that felt unfamiliar to all of us. The decision was not reversed, but it was no longer treated as settled either. My parents stopped speaking in absolutes. Phrases like already decided and this makes sense quietly disappeared from their conversations. In their place came pauses, questions, moments where they seemed to realize they were standing on ground that no longer felt solid. I noticed the change immediately. Calls became shorter but more deliberate. Plans were postponed rather than finalized. When paperwork was mentioned, it was followed by hesitation instead of certainty. The house itself became a kind of quiet presence between us, no longer a symbol of practicality, but a reminder of unresolved truth. Benjamin was different as well. He did not reach out to explain or defend himself. He did not thank me or apologize. What he did was become cautious. He asked fewer questions and made fewer assumptions. The ease with which he had once occupied the future shifted into something more tentative. It was subtle, but it mattered. I did not feel vindicated by this change. I felt the weight of consequence. Truth, once acknowledged, does not simplify relationships. It complicates them. My parents struggled with that complication. I could see it in the way my mother avoided my eyes when the house came up, in the way my father reread documents he had once skimmed without concern. They were not villains reckoning with guilt. They were people confronting the discomfort of realizing their sense of fairness had been incomplete. That discomfort did not resolve quickly. It lingered, altering the emotional temperature of every interaction. For a while, I wondered if this uncertainty was worse than the original decision. At least certainty, however unjust, had been predictable. This new phase required patience. It required all of us to sit with the consequences of having moved too quickly before. I did not rush to fill the silence. I did not offer solutions. That restraint was intentional. I understood now that my role was not to restore comfort by smoothing things over. It was to remain present without absorbing the discomfort on behalf of everyone else. There were moments when my parents hinted at compromise, testing the ground to see if I would step back into my old role. I did not. I listened. I acknowledged. I did not rescue. That was the hardest part. Justice does not always arrive as a clear outcome. Sometimes it arrives as a shift in responsibility, the responsibility to think more carefully, to speak more honestly, to recognize that actions have weight beyond their convenience. As weeks passed, the atmosphere remained subdued. No one pretended the issue had disappeared, but no one pushed it toward resolution either. That in-between space forced everyone to adjust. My parents began asking me questions about logistics they had previously handled without consulting me. They asked what I thought, not as a formality, but because they no longer felt comfortable assuming. That change did not feel like victory. It felt like recalibration. I did not take satisfaction in their unease. I felt a sober awareness of what it cost to disrupt a long-standing pattern. This was not the triumph of being proven right. It was the consequence of refusing to disappear quietly. The family dynamic had shifted, not because someone lost, but because the truth had altered what could be ignored. That alteration did not heal anything immediately. It created space. Space for reconsideration. Space for slower decisions. Space for each of us to confront what we had been avoiding. In that space, I learned an important lesson. Justice does not always bring relief. Sometimes it brings responsibility. Responsibility to hold boundaries without bitterness. Responsibility to remain steady when old patterns try to reassert themselves. Responsibility to accept that fairness often looks like discomfort before it looks like peace. The call from Benjamin came weeks later, after the initial uncertainty had settled into a tense normal. He did not mention the meeting directly. He asked how I was, commented on the weather, and spoke as if nothing significant had shifted between us. Then he explained why he was calling. There were delays, he said. Paperwork is moving more slowly than expected. Conversations are becoming more complicated than anyone anticipated. He framed it as an inconvenience rather than a consequence. He asked if I would be willing to help smooth things over, if I could reassure our parents, make it easier for everyone to move forward. The request was careful, almost polite. It was not an apology. It was transactional. He did not ask how the decision had affected me. He asked what I could do to reduce friction. Listening to him, I recognized the familiarity of the pattern. For years, I had been the person who absorbed discomfort so others could proceed unimpeded. This was that role returning, dressed up as a favor. I felt the impulse to explain myself rise and then fade. I did not need to justify my boundaries. I told him calmly that I was not able to help in that way. I said I wanted any decisions to move forward, honestly, without being simplified by my silence. He paused, surprised, and then tried again, suggesting that my cooperation would keep the family from unnecessary strain. He said everyone was tired, that it would be better if things could return to normal. Normal, I realized, meant predictable. It meant stepping back into a familiar position. I declined again, without anger, without elaboration. I did not accuse him of manipulation. I did not list grievances. I simply stated what I would and would not do. The conversation ended shortly after, polite but strained. In the days that followed, the practical consequences emerged. Without my quiet support, processes slowed. Decisions that had once moved quickly stalled. Benjamin encountered complications he had not anticipated, not because anyone punished him, but because the system no longer relied on my unspoken labor. He did not call to complain. He adjusted. My parents, too, felt the shift. They reached out more frequently, not to pressure me, but to ask questions they had previously answered on their own. I responded when appropriate, offering clarity without stepping into mediation. This was the hardest balance to maintain. Boundaries are not dramatic. They are repetitive. They require consistency. There were moments when I felt the old pull to step in, to restore ease, to make things less awkward. Each time, I reminded myself that discomfort was not the same as harm. Allowing others to experience the consequences of a changed dynamic was not cruelty. It was honesty. The audacity was not in Benjamin asking for help. It was assumed that I would resume my role without question. Declining that assumption did not make me adversarial. It made me present. I did not feel triumphant. I felt grounded. The situation did not resolve immediately, and it did not need to. What mattered was that the pattern had been interrupted. I was no longer negotiating my place through compliance. I was defining it through choice. That distinction reshaped my understanding of responsibility. Responsibility, I learned, does not always mean fixing what is uncomfortable. Sometimes it means allowing discomfort to do its work by stepping back without bitterness. I preserved my dignity and left space for others to recalibrate on their own terms. That was not revenge. It was a restraint. And in that restraint, something steadier than victory began to take hold. As the weeks passed, I began to understand something I had never been taught directly. Boundaries are often mistaken for punishment, especially by people who benefited from their absence. When I stopped stepping in automatically, some assumed I was withholding out of spite. I was not. I was learning how to exist without overextending myself. That distinction mattered, and it took time for me to believe it myself. I had spent years equating love with availability, responsibility with accommodation. If someone needed help, I provided it. If a situation felt unfair, I absorbed it quietly. Saying no felt unnatural, even unkind. But watching how the family adjusted in my absence clarified what boundaries actually do. They do not create distance for the sake of control. They create definition. They show where one person ends and another begins. That clarity does not harm relationships that are built on mutual respect. It challenges relationships that rely on silent sacrifice. I reflected often on how easily I had confused endurance with virtue. I believed that if I stayed patient long enough, fairness would eventually appear. What I did not see was how my patience had become a resource others drew from without realizing it was finite. Setting boundaries did not punish anyone. It removed a cushion that had softened the impact of rushed decisions. Without that cushion, people had to move more carefully. That was not cruelty. It was balanced. I also noticed how my own internal landscape shifted. I was less anxious before family conversations. I no longer rehearsed explanations or anticipated objections. When I spoke plainly. When I chose not to engage, I did so without guilt. This did not make interactions easier in the short term, but it made them honest. Honesty, I learned, is often uncomfortable before it becomes stabilizing. There were moments of regret, moments when I wondered if I could have handled things differently years ago, if earlier resistance might have prevented this outcome. I allowed those thoughts to pass without judgment. Regret is only useful when it informs the present, not when it rewrites the past. The lesson was not that I should have fought sooner. It was that I was allowed to choose differently now. My parents were navigating their own realizations. I could see it in the way they spoke more slowly, asked more questions, and hesitated before deciding. They were not suddenly transformed, but they were more aware. That awareness did not come from confrontation. It came from adjustment, from experiencing a dynamic without the quiet support they had come to expect. I did not frame this as justice served. Justice, in this context, was not about correction or compensation. It was about alignment, about allowing reality to reflect truth rather than convenience. Boundaries do not punish. They reveal. Healing did not arrive with an apology or a rewritten ending. It came quietly, through small shifts that accumulated over time. There was no moment where everything was resolved and named as such. Instead, there were ordinary days that felt different because I felt different within them. Family conversations grew less charged, not because the past had been erased, but because I was no longer bracing myself inside them. I spoke when I had something to say, and stayed silent when I did not, without translating either choice into worth. That freedom was new. I noticed it most in the absence of the tension I used to carry home with me. I no longer replayed conversations late into the night or rehearsed responses for conflicts that had not yet happened. The house was still the house. Its future remained complicated. But it no longer defined my sense of belonging. My parents adjusted in their own ways. They were more cautious, more deliberate, less certain of their assumptions. We did not revisit the original announcement in detail. We did not need to. What mattered was that the dynamic had changed. Decisions were no longer framed as conclusions delivered to me. They were conversations. sometimes imperfect, sometimes awkward, but no longer dismissive. Benjamin and I found a quieter distance, not estrangement, not closeness, but something neutral and workable. We spoke when necessary, without pretending we had returned to an earlier version of our relationship. That honesty felt like progress, healing. I realized does not require everyone to understand you fully. It requires that you stop abandoning yourself to maintain harmony. I took that lesson into other parts of my life. I noticed how often I had said yes out of habit rather than intention. I began to pause, to consider, to choose. The steadiness that followed was subtle but lasting. It did not make me invulnerable. It made me grounded. There were moments of sadness, moments when I mourned the version of family I had believed in for so long. I let that grief exist without rushing it away. Letting go of an illusion is its own form of loss, but it is also the beginning of something more honest. I learned that closure does not always come from outcomes. It comes from alignment, from knowing that you acted in a way that respected your own reality, even when doing so felt uncomfortable. The story did not end with a victory or a defeat. It ended with clarity. I did not need to prove my value or secure a particular result to move forward. I needed to stop participating in a system that depended on my silence. Once I did that, peace followed naturally, not as a reward, but as a consequence. Quiet closure looks unremarkable from the outside. It does not announce itself. It settles in gradually, reshaping how you stand in your own life. That was the healing I found. Not dramatic, not triumphant, simply real.